All right. Let's dive into this conservative playbook, shall we? We've got mandate for leadership, the conservative promise, and boy, oh boy, it seems like they've got a whole new blueprint for America.
It's not just blueprints, it's a whole wish list for if they're holding all the cards. We're talking potential government overhauls, policy shakeups, the whole 9 yards.
And they're not exactly subtle about it either.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, they're calling the next election the one chance to get it right.
Kind of intense, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That kind of language is very deliberate. It's meant to create a sense of urgency, maybe even a little fear among their base. Like, hey, this is it, folks. Our last shot to save America as we know it.
Yeah, there's a lot of that us versus them framing going on. It's like they're saying you're either with us or you're with the, well, you get the idea. Exactly. And that us is very specifically defined. It's about going back to what they see as America's founding principles, what they call restoring our republic to its original moorings.
Which kind of implies that things have gone way off course, right?
Yeah.
Like America's somehow lost its way.
Right. It plays into this narrative that many conservatives subscribe to, that America has strayed from its roots and it's time for a major course correction.
A big part of that course correction, it seems, is dismantling what they call the administrative state. In fact, they explicitly state, quote, "The surest way to put the federal government back to work for the American people is to reduce its size and scope," end quote.
You hit the nail on the head there. It's about shrinking the government, but it's more than that. It's about who they see as having too much power.
So for those who might not be familiar with the term, what exactly is the administrative state, and why is it public enemy number one for these guys?
Well, in simple terms, it's that vast network of federal agencies. Think the EPA, the FDA, the Department of Education, all those departments and agencies responsible for actually implementing and enforcing laws passed by Congress.
So they're the ones making sure our air is clean, our food is safe, our kids are, well, learning something in school.
Exactly. They're the ones setting the rules and regulations that govern everyday life. And for conservatives, that's precisely the problem.
Too much government overreach.
Exactly. They see this massive bureaucracy as stifling individual freedom and economic growth, bogging everything down with red tape and regulations.
They'd probably say it's all those unelected bureaucrats making decisions that impact our lives instead of, the people we actually vote for.
You've got it. They argue that this concentration of power in unelected hands is a threat to democracy and that it undermines accountability to the American people.
And they're not just talking about it in the abstract either. They give some pretty specific examples of what they see as administrative overreach. Like, for instance, they're particularly concerned about how international agreements are handled.
Oh, absolutely. They argue that the current administration is using these agencies to essentially bypass Congress when it comes to these amendments, sidelining the people's elected representatives.
It's like they see this shadowy network of bureaucrats making deals behind closed doors, and they want to bring it all back into the light of congressional oversight.
And that's a crucial point. The debate over the administrative state isn't just about the size of government. It's about who's actually in control, about the balance of power between the branches of government.
So it's less about government is too big and more about government is doing things WE don't like.
You could say that it's about ideology and control as much as it is about efficiency or size. It's about shifting the balance of power back towards elected officials, who they believe are more directly accountable to the people.
Which is interesting because, and maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but the document also emphasizes the need for a really strong, proactive president.
Right, and that's what makes this so fascinating. They want to shrink the government overall, but empower the executive branch, particularly the presidency.
Okay, so it's not just smaller government. It's specific parts smaller and other parts bigger.
That's the paradox, and that's where we're headed next, exploring their vision for what they call a hands-on presidency. And let me tell you, it's a pretty interesting vision.
A little bit. Trust us, we know best.
Maybe, but we'll let you be the judge of that. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the specifics of their plan and what it could mean for the future of American governance.
All right, so we've covered how this document wants to shrink what they call the administrative state and put a very hands-on president in charge.
All while aiming for a smaller government overall, which is where things get tricky.
Right, it's like they want to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into that contradiction, let's zoom out to the global stage. This is where their foreign policy stance gets really interesting and a little concerning, to be honest.
You're not wrong to find it concerning. Remember how they called the next election the one chance to get it right? That sense of urgency, even a bit of fear-mongering, carries over into their views on foreign policy, particularly when it comes to China.
Oh yeah, they don't hold back. It's almost like they see a world on the brink of chaos, and only a strong America, led by their ideology, can set things straight.
That's a good way to put it. The document paints a very stark picture with China as the primary antagonist, a threat to both American economic dominance and global security.
And their solution, well, let's just say they're big fans of peace through strength. They argue that the only way to deal with China is by showing them who's boss, militarily and economically.
It's a very hawkish stance, advocating for a massive increase in military spending, modernizing the nuclear arsenal, even suggesting a two-war force strategy, meaning they want the U.S. ready to fight two major wars at the same time.
Hold on a second, 2 wars at once. That seems a little overkill, doesn't it? I mean, I get wanting a strong defense, but that feels like preparing for every possible scenario, even the unlikely ones.
That's a valid point. It speaks to a larger worldview where American power is paramount. They're not just concerned with defending U.S. borders, but with projecting dominance on a global scale. It's about reasserting America as the world's policeman, so to speak, which is a controversial idea, to say the least.
And it's not just about military strength either, right? They also talk about taking on China in the economic arena.
Absolutely. They want to pressure China on trade, encourage allies to take a tougher stance, and even advocate for reducing economic dependence on China, even if it means some short-term costs for the U.S.
So it's like a multi-pronged strategy, military, economic, diplomatic, all aimed at containing China's rise. They even suggest things like making it easier for military recruiters to access high schools, almost like they're gearing up for a new Cold War.
That's an interesting parallel to draw, and not entirely inaccurate. There are definitely echoes of Cold War thinking in their approach to China, a sense of ideological competition, a focus on military buildup, and a willingness to engage in proxy conflicts around the world.
Okay, so we've got a more aggressive foreign policy centered on confronting China, a smaller government, supposedly, and a powerful hands-on president. You're starting to see a pattern here. It's like they're crafting a vision of America that's ready to flex its muscles on the world stage.
And not just on the world stage, but also within its own borders. Remember that tension we talked about, wanting a smaller government but also wanting to shape social policy. Well, that's where things get even more interesting and potentially even more controversial.
Yeah, because for a document that talks so much about individual liberty and limited government, they sure do have a lot of opinions on how people should live their lives, especially when it comes to social issues.
Exactly. And that's where their vision of a smaller government takes a backseat to their desire to promote a very specific set of social values, often rooted in traditional religious beliefs.
Okay, so let's unpack this culture war battlefield as they see it. Where do they want to direct their firepower?
Well, they dedicate a significant chunk of the document to what they call the dangers of cultural Marxism, which they see as a threat to traditional American values. This is where they target issues related to gender, sexuality, and education, and this is where some of their most controversial proposals come into play.
And by controversial, you mean some people would say extreme, right? I mean, we're talking about potentially rolling back decades of social progress.
That's one way to put it. For example, let's take abortion. They go beyond simply defunding Planned Parenthood, which is already a controversial stance. They want a complete ban on any federal funding for abortion, and they even suggest withholding U.S. funds from international organizations that support abortion rights. That's a pretty aggressive stance.
Yeah, it feels like they're not just trying to restrict access to abortion, but actively punish organizations that don't align with their views.
And that's a key theme that runs through this entire section of the document. It's not enough for them to enact policies that reflect their values. They also want to use the power of the government to discourage or even punish those who disagree.
And it's not just abortion, right? They also target LGBTQ rights, particularly when it comes to transgender individuals.
Absolutely. They propose rolling back protections for transgender people in various areas, including healthcare access, participation in sports, and even military service. They essentially want to define gender based on biological sex at birth, ignoring the lived experiences of transgender individuals.
It's like they're trying to legislate their worldview into existence, even if it means erasing or marginalizing entire groups of people.
And it doesn't stop there. They also want to influence the culture more broadly, promoting traditional family structures through government programs and advocating for greater parental control over education.
Okay, so let's talk about education for a minute, because that seems to be a major battleground for them. They keep mentioning this idea of cultural Marxism infiltrating schools. What exactly do they mean by that?
It's a loaded term, often used to discredit progressive ideas and educators. They see things like comprehensive sex education, discussions about race and inequality, and even the acceptance of LGBTQ identities as part of this cultural Marxism agenda.
So basically, anything that challenges their worldview or promotes critical thinking about social issues is seen as a threat.
That's one way to interpret it. They argue that parents should have more control over what their children learn in school, and they push for things like school choice and stricter guidelines on curriculum content.
It almost feels like they're afraid of their children being exposed to different perspectives, different ways of thinking about the world.
That's a fair assessment. They see education as a way to transmit their values to the next generation, and they're concerned about what they perceive as competing ideologies gaining influence. It's about control, ultimately, control over information, ideas, and the future of American society as they envision it.
Okay, so we've got this push for a smaller government in some areas, but at the same time, they want to wield that government's power to shape social policy and culture according to their beliefs. It's giving me whiplash.
It's a tricky balancing act, and it reveals the inherent contradictions within their ideology. They want less government intrusion in their lives, but they're more than willing to use that same government to impose their values on others.
It seems like it all boils down to whose liberty they're actually concerned about. Yep.
That's a sharp observation, and it gets to the heart of the matter. Their vision of America might offer more freedom and opportunity for some, but it could also mean less freedom and fewer opportunities for others, particularly those who don't fit neatly into their worldview.
It's a sobering thought. So where do we go from here? We've explored their plans for a smaller government, a more assertive foreign policy, and a hands-on approach to social issues. What does it all add up to?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we'll explore in our final part. We'll be examining the potential consequences of this vision, both good and bad, and leave you with a thought-provoking question to consider as you continue to navigate the complex world of American politics.
So we've spent this deep dive really getting into the weeds of this mandate for leadership thing.
More like spelunking through their vision for America, right? We've gone from shrinking the government to confronting China to, well, getting pretty prescriptive about their values.
And let's be real, some of it's a bit jarring, right?
Yeah.
Like, how can they be all about individual liberty one minute, then turn around and advocate for policies that feel like, well, the opposite?
It's that classic tension, isn't it? Where do you draw the line between individual freedom and, say, government stepping in to shape social values? That's a debate that's been raging since, well, forever.
And it doesn't seem like they have an easy answer either, judging by this document. More like they want the freedom to live by their values, but aren't so keen on others having the same freedom if those values clash.
Which is why it's crucial to understand this isn't some theoretical debate. It's about real people's lives. If they get their way, what would this vision actually look like for everyday Americans? That's the question we got to ask.
Okay, so paint us a picture. What's the real-world impact of all these proposals, both the good and the bad?
Well, for starters, their vision of a smaller government, it's not as simple as less government, everyone wins. It's about WHO benefits from that smaller government and who might get left out in the cold.
Right, because they're not talking about cutting everything equally, are they? It's more like trimming the fat in places they think are wasteful while beefing up areas they see as crucial.
Exactly. So you might see fewer social programs, less environmental regulation, lower taxes perhaps. Sounds good to some, right? But on the flip side, you might also see fewer protections for vulnerable communities, less funding for public services, and a widening gap between the haves and have-nots.
And let's not forget their hawkish stance on foreign policy. More military spending, a more aggressive posture towards China that has consequences too, right?
Absolutely. It could mean a greater risk of conflict, a bigger military-industrial complex, and less focus on diplomacy and international cooperation.
So it's a mixed bag, to put it mildly. Some people might see their vision as a recipe for a stronger, more prosperous America, while others see it as a step backwards towards a less just and less equitable society.
And that's exactly the point. There's no single right answer here. It all depends on your values, your priorities, and your vision for what kind of country America should be.
Which is why it's so important for people to actually read this stuff, right? To not just accept the sound bites, but to really grapple with the complexities and the potential consequences.
Absolutely. Because the knowledge is power, and understanding these issues is the first step towards shaping a future that reflects your values, not just the values of those in power.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the nitty-gritty of policy proposals to the broader philosophical underpinnings of this conservative vision.
It's been quite the journey. We've explored their desire for a smaller government, their assertive stance on the world stage, and their very particular ideas about how social values should be shaped.
And while we may not agree with everything in this document, and we certainly don't expect you to either, we hope this deep dive has given you a clearer understanding of where a significant portion of the American right wants to take this country.
Because ultimately, whether you find this vision appealing or appalling, it's a vision that has the potential to reshape America as we know it. And that's a conversation worth having, engaging with, and ultimately shaping with your own informed voice.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This is just the beginning of the conversation, folks. Keep asking questions, keep digging for answers, and keep those critical thinking caps on. Until next time.